In this lecture, we will take a very brief look at the connection that may or may not exist between biology and behavior. It should be mentioned at the start of this lecture that biological and biosocial theories regarding criminal behavior are things that are extremely controversial. Additionally, as one attempts to connect or marry social psychological theories and the idea of, in this case, deviance, one has to be very, very careful to consider all of the variables that may be at work in the interrelatedness of those two constructs. It should also be emphasized that there is little to no evidence that criminal behavior is directly caused by or strongly relatable to abnormal physiology as it relates to the brain. And so it's very important that we keep that in mind because in criminal justice circles today, and I would say this is especially the case when we expand this topic to incorporate political circles as well, it is very easy for people to connect mental health and deviance. There can be relationships between these two concepts. However, things like causality are things that we should very much shy away from when we're trying to connect these two expressions. We have to take into consideration environment. We have to take into consideration growth and development. We have to take into consideration socialization. We have to take into consideration neuroscience and what we know and what we don't know and what we're striving to know. We have to consider and take into consideration, in this case, human genetics. So there are a lot of pieces that are at work here, and so we have to be very, very cautious as we are attempting to look at theories and apply theories that, by their nature, are biological and criminological. Let's begin to scratch the surface of this subject by looking at reasoning. From here, we'll move to personality, and then we'll let the rest up to you with regard to the decision to make regarding the connection between biology and behavior. If we're going to start out with reasoning and look at the development of rational thought as it relates to our behaviors and how we may or may not act on an emotion or on some sort of external stimulus, we have to engage the work of Jean Piaget. Born in 1896, Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist who immediately noticed the connection between, in this case, age and reason. His experiments were very much behavioral in nature, and they were principally focused on the reasoning skills of children. Now, what Piaget did is he presented children of varying ages and age groupings with conundrums, or with, in this case, intellectual tests that would be very similar to a puzzle or a predicament that needed to be solved. And his interest was to look at consistency with regard to how children of various ages approached a problem or a puzzle. He also was extremely interested in their reasoning with regard to how they approached or attempted to develop a solution. Out of his research, and again, it was very much scientific in nature in terms of the methods he applied, and this notion of replication was extremely important to Piaget. It was also something that was environmentally rooted in a laboratory setting. But the outgrowth of this had to do with developmental stages. And so his ultimate findings connected to reasoning skills and ultimately connected the notion of a reasoning skill to age. Today, when we talk about this subject, we usually will talk about operational skills. It's similar but slightly different. He recognized operational stages then as it relates to the development of reason in a human being, and then how that human being will reason at particular points in that developmental history. Piaget and his students ultimately agreed upon 4 operational stages with regard to the development of reason. And we'll kind of take a brief look at each of these 4. The first, that coinciding with the years of birth to 2, is referred to as a sensory motor stage. Generally, in this stage or during this stage, there will be limitations. Generally, these will be limitations regarding an individual's ability to interact with physically the environment. The other piece that is at work here is that we are desperately trying to understand our environment. And we do this by interacting with it as best we can, touching, listening, looking. Sucking or suckling is also something that is helping to connect us to our environment at this point. According to Piaget and of course others who have built off of this first sensory motor stage, the idea of thought is really not present. Infants, in a sense, are not thinking in any real sense or in any way that we understand. They are, in a sense, gathering data. They are at a point of discovery. Right? And infants, in a sense, are not necessarily at this point strongly understanding or even being able to understand the ideas of cause and effect. So it's very much just getting the actions that we have physiologically organized and using those physiological abilities to understand what's around us. From this sensory motor stage, then, as we move beyond the age of 2, we see a pre-operational stage. And again, this relates to ages 2 to 7. Now, during this stage, children will start to develop an understanding of symbols, and they will be able to increasingly understand that these are abstract representations of things, or at least they will start to move in that direction. And so, for example, in the study of linguistics, we realize that between the age of 2 and 7, children are able to understand the alphabet, and they are able to connect alphabet symbols with phonemes or contrastive sounds. The limitation at this particular stage is that they are not yet understanding common concepts or commonly held concepts having to do with things like or I guess measures of things. So if you talk about the size of something, or if you talk about movement and you are describing varying speeds, or the cause of a movement, generally young people between the ages of 2 and 7 are not really connecting all the dots with regard to this. They're able to understand what you're talking about, of course, and associate, in this case, speed or size with an object and an action. However, being able to rationalize that more deeply and in a very abstract way is something that we don't see in this pre-operational stage. Um, We move then into a concrete operational stage. This would be kind of a third stage, coinciding with the ages of 7 to 12. We start to see some reasoning abilities developing, and we also realize that they are starting to become concrete as it relates to the memory of an individual and how we emotionalize that memory and how we ultimately draw upon those memories, short and long term, to be able to make decisions. Children at this point are understanding things like numbers more deeply. The idea of causation is very much present, and they are able to understand something about roles, social roles. The role that a mother plays, a father plays. Generally, family-based roles are the first kinds of things that are being uh, gathered at this point, and these roles are also extremely important to the general socialization of the child. It's not just mother or father, but again, it's more just anyone in their closest and most intimate social units. So I use those as examples, but those are not necessarily required. But the understanding that roles exist and that people, their behaviors, their actions are connected to those particular roles. Those are things that in traditional social development between the ages of 7 and 12, with some exceptions, young people will begin to connect those dots. But again, they need concrete evidence, they need concrete examples. They cannot yet come to those conclusions and make those concrete understandings part of their um, overall cognition without a concrete example as being part of that. Anthropologists who are looking at this through an evolutionary lens, and we'll eventually get to that near the end of the lecture, will sometimes use language studies among non-human primates as a means of being able to understand how and why we as human beings eventually moved beyond the need for a concrete example to be able to express oneself or to be able to more deeply understand something at an abstract level. The fourth and final stage is a formal operational stage. This is something that we witness as early as the age of 11 or 12, and it is something that then bridges into later adolescence and early adulthood. So again, it's occurring after the age generally of 12. And here we notice that adolescents or children are now capable of abstract thought. They do not need necessarily a concrete example in front of them or to interact with it in some way, shape, or form, either physically or cognitively, to be able to understand it. They can talk about things that are not present. They can come to conclusions regarding interactions of things. They can engage the idea of cause and effect. And generally, in terms of criminological theory, we realize that once we get to this point, we have all of the pieces in place to be able to make a judgment and make a judgment that will have some sort of consequence. And we will be able to understand the swiftness of that consequence and ultimately the nature of that consequence. Yet, and you'll see this as you probe more deeply into the correctional system, and of course, as you continue your studies in criminal justice, you'll realize that we still consider these individuals to not yet be adults. Right? We still treat them as juveniles, especially in a correctional setting. And as I've said before in other lectures, when we're talking about how a juvenile system is working, the idea of reform, the idea of transition, The idea that it is a little more temporary in nature. These are things that are built into that system of deterrence and ultimately that system of rehabilitation. So, in this formal operational stage, we realize that children, in a sense, have become young philosophers. And as uh, an anthropologist would look at it, they have risen above a level of cognition, or they have reached a level of cognition that we do not see in any other member of the animal kingdom. Um, Again, language studies, especially the more famous studies having to do with symbolic action, let's say sign language, and cognition among great apes. These have told us that uh, non human primates require some sort of concrete example at some point in the learning and development um, landscape as it relates to a study or a concept. They have to be connected to it in some way, shape, or form, physically or in a concrete way, to be able to understand it or act on it. When we look at the human model, this formal operational stage is intrinsic to the human species, and it is something that is extremely unique. And it is something that I would say, if we look at it broadly, it is something that lies at the heart of how our legal system approaches deviance. What we have to ask ourselves, and this is where it becomes a little more controversial, but I think, again, if we approach it in a reasonable way, it's something that we can at least engage and think deeply and broadly about. Um, are there things that will, in a sense, interfere with this kind of cognitive development? Are there things that are biological that may hinder the process? So, language acquisition, does that, in a sense, connect to this in any way, shape, or form if there is a delay in that kind of process? Or trauma, an environmental component. If a young person experiences trauma, let's say at the age of 2, how might that impact their development of reasoning skills? Does it slow it? Does it speed it up? Does it hinder particular aspects of reasoning and the application of logic? So these are the kinds of things that allow us to now start to connect, in a sense, to biosocial constructs and concerns. Um, and we can even start to engage the idea of whether or not some sort of behavior as it relates to the development of one's reasoning as a child, can that be inherited? Is there a variable that is inherited from a parent that then connects with the development of reasoning and ultimately a related behavior? Now, when we start to ask those larger biological and biosocial questions, that then moves us into the realm of psychology. So, a lot of what we see when it comes to biological and biosocial theories, really at their heart, are psychological in nature or are pioneered historically by the work of psychologists. And so, to move it a little further down the road, we should start looking at the idea of self as it relates to growth and development and socialization, and then also personality. And so those two constructs become extremely important. And those are all things that are neurological in nature, but things that also have sociological and I would say behavioral um, outputs, things that we can see real time outside of the individual beyond their neurophysiology, beyond their neural function. So let's take a closer look at self and reason. If this was a course in psychology, we would immediately address the work of Sigmund Freud and, of course, his graduate students to be able to start to build what we understand of the self and ultimately the development of what we recognize to be personality. However, this is a course in sociology, so we're going to kind of move rather rapidly into and through this uh, construct or this concept, and we'll start with self in a sense. Now, the development of reasoning is important to be able to make decisions. We've already kind of come to that conclusion, and these are decisions that might tie in very intimately to the idea of consequence. The self is also extremely important because as we start to see that develop, we realize that it is helping the individual understand their location in the larger social and cultural world. And so the self is an individual construct. It is something intimate to the person, but it also helps us to juxtapose who we are in relation to those who we are associating with. The thing that's hard to do, and this is something that I didn't mention about reasoning, but it is something that can be applied to reasoning as well, is that in terms of culture, the self, your ability to reason, and the development of what we recognize to be a personality are things that are not going to be universal in nature. You're not going to have a person develop the same self at the same rate as it relates to something like, let's say, gender in all human cultures. Even though we know that gender is a very good topic to be able to connect behavior, society, and biology. But even those lines, we would think, are very clear. Of course, living in the modern world today, we realize that that's not always a very kind of clear delineation. When we're talking about the self, another important component here is that we want to really realize something about what's going on around the person. So as an individual starts to piece together in their early developmental years, as they approach the age of 13 and eventually as they start to approach early adulthood, they are now starting to see both in concrete ways and very abstract ways who they are. And the process by which this is happening is the process of socialization. Socialization, although it is addressed in a variety of academic fields, is something very important to the work of the sociologist. Socialization, in a sense, is any growth and development, cognitively, socially, even to a lesser extent, physiologically, through the life of the individual, but then also um, it patterns what's going on among groups and among societies on a larger scale. We are socialized with regard to our emotions. That's how we start to see something like personality develop. We are socialized in terms of our values, and that's where we start to see judgments regarding right and wrong start to connect with the concept of self and of individual. We are socialized to understand something about role and expectation. So, the role of a parent, the role of a sibling, the role of ourselves in relation to one of those units, something that we learn very early on as we're growing and developing. So, socialization, in a sense, gives us a deeper understanding as to why things like personality and reason may not be 100% universal in nature. Socialization will vary, and it will vary by culture, it will vary by group, it will vary by household. It is a very challenging concept to be able to identify. So any study that you're looking at that is trying to connect biology and behavior and is using something like socialization in the early years of one's growth and development to explain one's conduct, you must look at how the author in that study or how the researcher collecting that data is defining and more deeply understanding the process of socialization. And then you need to look at where that process of socialization is occurring. Where's the house? Where's the neighborhood? Where's the city? Where's the town? Where's the village? What kind of landscape? What's the surrounding environment like? Is it historical? Is it modern? So these are all things that you have to take into consideration because socialization can be very site specific. There are qualities, and we see this in the concept of the family and the concepts inside of the family, things like gender and age and social status to a limited degree. These kinds of concepts, as they connect to a process like socialization in the development of the self and the development of personality or emotion, these things can be more species specific. However, we know that human beings are extremely complex, and so we can never stay within the confines of those biological units. We have to move out into a more social environment to see how the self continues to develop, how it is modeled and remodeled as a person ages. The last point here that I would like to connect to the development of self and the process of socialization is the development of personality. And so personality, it exists in an area between reason and emotion. It is embodied by things like self, but it is generally a much larger concept or construct. Personality, in a sense, is that point in the development of the self where we start to associate with others, where we start to connect with the world around us. And it's giving us a sense of how that connection is being made. The personality is the bridge. And it is not a unilinear kind of bridge in the sense that it's a one-way bridge, but as we start to make those connections and associations with others around us, and not only the health of ourselves in terms of our emotions, uh, our anatomy and physiology, not only is that a factor, but also the health, social and physical of those around us that we are making connections with play a very important role in how personality, albeit something that really does have, at least in terms of its origin, a uniquely human and uniquely biological point, how that personality now is going to connect with behavior in a societal environment. And that's another one of these bridges that we can use to better understand the connection between biology and behavior. So, health, socially appropriate expressions of emotion. These are things that are all reinforced through connections with others. And again, these are not universal necessarily in nature. There are universal qualities of them in their early development. How we understand or just generally express an emotion, such as sadness or fear, is something that is very much biologically rooted. It's something that has, according to evolutionary theorists, has helped us to survive over a significant amount of time. But how we then act on that is something much larger and is something that crosses well over into the world of the social. Well, that brings us to the most important point with regard to this lecture, looking at the connection between, in this case, biology and behavior. But now we have to make the connection between biology and behavior that may not be appropriate given particular situation, and behavior that may, by the larger society and its rules, criminal. Ronald Akers provides us with, in this case, some pretty important ideas as we start to connect these two concepts. He, in this case, is quoting Fishman when he writes, as a rule, what is inherited is not a behavior. Rather, it is the way in which an individual responds to the environment. What is he getting at here? The idea here is that what we are inheriting, not only from our parents, but over time, in terms of what our species is providing to us, is the ability to adapt to an environment. And that process of adaptation, in a sense, is behavioral. And in a sense, the judgments that we are making are, in terms of their foundations, neurological in nature and neurophysical. If there are things that are interfering with that judgmental process, again, connecting to our environment and being reinforced by the feedback we get from that environment, then those are things that we have to look at a little more closely, especially if they are resulting in a behavior that does not fit that environmental stimulus. In fact, it may work against the idea of adaptation or survival. In a sense, he continues, it provides an orientation, a predisposition, or a tendency to behave in a certain fashion. The biological values do not necessarily exceed normal limits. It would not alarm a practicing physician. The idea here is that values that are biological in nature or that have a source of biology will be things that, to those outside of the individual, they'll be things that should be predictable. When they don't meet or conform to those models of expectation, now we have a situation where a person is intrinsically behaving in a way that is deviant. It's not fitting what we expect of that situation. So, for example, if we look at or we use a neurobiological lens to be able to look at crime, we have a few things to consider. And brain chemistry and the chemistry of the physiological systems which connect to and interact with, in this case, our central nervous system, are things that should be considered as we are trying or attempting to explain behaviors that are not necessarily fitting a situation. If, for example, we look at something like abnormally high levels of testosterone, we may have something to look at, or at least a variable to consider, as we are trying to understand abnormal approaches toward sexual behavior. Or if we have a male, for example, that appears to have an abnormally expressive sexual drive. So the brain chemistry, or at least the chemistry that the brain is being exposed to at this particular point, can help us to better understand adult deviance as it relates to sexual activity. Okay, so this is just one example of that particular connection. Or if we look at another measure of cognition, in this case intelligence, if we have extremely low or extremely high expressions of or measures of intelligence, let's say we're looking at IQ, we may also have something that is telling us about advantage or disadvantage as it relates to cognition in a situation. So if we have a problem, do you and I, or does person A or person B, given their intelligence, given their IQ, given the measure of IQ that they are labeled with in a sense, do they have an advantage or disadvantage to be able to work through that problem and come to a socially acceptable outcome as it relates to a dilemma. Now, what you'll find is that IQ is another kind of dangerous spot, because with IQ we know that things like age, life history, culture, education, all of these things do have some sort of connection with that measure. And if we have other environmental pieces at work that may be reinforcing or improving, or in the case of maybe even exposure to a heavy metal like lead in water, this could have a negative effect on a measure of intelligence or IQ given a particular age or a time or duration of exposure. These are things that also need to be considered along with the biology and where currently is in being able to make a decision or act or not act on some sort of internal drive or some sort of um, decision that one is making regarding a situation. So it is these considerations, along with even things today, such as genetic factors, that we are attempting to more deeply understand and then connect back to the idea of behavior. It's still something that is quite unresolved, but it is something that, in a sense, we are attempting to do and we are attempting to provide without allowing discrimination to come into the equation. The idea that now I will prejudge an individual based on the following factors that I connect to their biology. We can never do that. That's a line we should never cross. But the question we have to ask ourselves, is there something biological, something measurable with regard to neurophysiology or molecular genetics or molecular biology that we are able to then say, let's consider this, let's add this to what we already know of what a person is experiencing environmentally and what we already know with regard to an individual's conduct. The last thing I would just want to make mention of is that evolutionary component as well. In most academic disciplines, evolutionary biology has a place in the discussion of a variety of topics. In criminology, evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology both contribute to this question regarding human biology or biology in general and behavior. Where these particular specialized areas will start to talk about deviance or engage deviance really relates to universal species-wide kinds of concepts. So, for example, things like gender. Does gender, in a sense, impact behavior? Well, there are things that are uniquely male. There are things that are uniquely female in terms of growth and development, in terms of physiology, that may in some way, shape, or form contribute to a particular behavior. I had mentioned sexual hormone, a sexual hormone like testosterone. This will contribute to a biologically male behavior. And of course, there are exceptions, high versus low, and everything in between in terms of the expression of this hormone and antibiotic steroid. But in this case, the evolutionary principles will focus more on the universality of gender and conduct, or gender and life circumstance or life history, or gender and behavior. And as I said before, especially with evolutionary biology, they will also attempt to understand something about the origin of a particular behavior and how it functioned at its point of origin and how it continues to function today. So when we talked about maximization, when we applied economic theory to, in this case, deviance, the idea of gain and misconduct, the notion of gain, the notion of profiteering, the notion of not only surviving, but being able to create surplus in a food source or in the availability of of mates in a, let's say, a primatological setting is something that an evolutionary biologist and an evolutionary psychologist will look at as they are trying to understand something about, in this case, a deviant behavior like theft. Um, so these are also areas that we really have to look at a little more closely, whether we agree with them or not. It is part of this area within criminal justice studies where we see biological and biosocial theories being applied to explaining criminal behavior, or at least understanding it.